This is Brain Ponderings with Mark Mattson, conversations with scientists at the forefront of brain research. It's my pleasure today to talk with Michael Platt. He's professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he holds an endowed chair. He's also on the faculty in the Wharton Business School. And towards the latter part of our talk, I think we'll talk about that because he's been translating the work he'd initially done in non-human primates, understanding how the brain makes decisions to humans and how to perhaps optimize or improve decision-making by individuals and groups of people. So Michael, your bachelor's degree and your PhD at Yale and Penn respectively were in biological anthropology. How did you get interested in evolution and particularly brain evolution?
Yeah, great question. So it is kind of ironic that I have three different appointments here at Penn in neuroscience, psychology, and marketing. I don't have any credentials in any of those fields. So it's a dirty secret, I think, that I'm not accredited to teach any of these things. But yeah, biological anthropology was my first love. When I was a kid growing up in Ohio, I guess, I could think about it as like I was interested in nature, but specifically and really what really grabbed me was evolution and human evolution and primate evolution in particular. And I don't know why. I mean, I grew up in a working class family and nobody was talking about these things, and we did not. They were not topics that we encountered in my public schools either. But I do give a little credit, maybe a lot of credit, to Time Life books. And my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who he was like a manager at a local grocery store, and somehow, like, I don't know, for sales or something, one of their rewards was this whole collection of Time Life books. And so he would sort of dole them out to me, every few months. And so there was one called The Primates, and one called Evolution, and one called Animal Behavior. And I kept them all under my bed, and I read them and reread them every night. I wish I had them. I need to find these books, but
did you have National Geographic too? Because now you're triggering memories of mine looking at that too.
You're right, I did. Yeah, we subscribed to National Geographic. I think I was the one who was like, I saw it once and I was like, that's what I need. This is what I want to read all the time. So that's how it got started. And now I'm here in the business school.
And then you became a neuroscientist, even though you claim otherwise. You are definitely a neuroscientist. Your postdoc work at NYU is hardcore neuroscience. Can you talk about that? That's really what launched your career, your entire career.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, between undergraduate and graduate work, I guess I spent about 8 years studying biological anthropology. So that's a very broad portfolio, let's say, of approaches to understanding human nature. That's how I think about it. It's like from the perspective of biology, comparative behavior, paleoanthropology, linguistics, etc. But by the time I was finishing up my PhD work, which was examining basically adaptive specializations of learning and memory for different kinds, foraging on different kinds of foods. So I was comparing two monkey species that where everything else was the same. Their social structure was exactly the same. They're small-bodied primates from South America, but they differed in what they ate, And so And so one had to range very far looking for fruit, and one could just eat gums and sit on one tree. So it was a pretty, blunt like experiment, to so to say, to predict that one would have much longer lasting and extensive spatial memory than the other. But so I did those experiments, which is a whole other story. But it became clear to me that wow, I really need to understand how this is happening in the brain. And I was too far along in my PhD to sort of start doing that work as part of the PhD. So I started looking around for opportunities to really switch gears as a postdoc. And I was really lucky to get connected with Paul Glimcher at NYU. And Paul had been a PhD student and a postdoc here at Penn. And so he knew my PhD advisors very well. And when he was starting his lab, he needed a warm body to come in and put together equipment and start, training monkeys. And so the rest is history. It ended up being a really great match. Not without its trials and tribulations, to be sure. And I had to learn, I took the graduate curriculum in neuroscience at NYU while trying to do all the other work because I didn't know anything. I'd read some books, but that was about it.
Yeah, and that's, learning electrophysiology, recording from neurons in the brains of animals and particularly when they're awake, alert.
Yeah.
This is technically very demanding.
I think it's one of the hardest things to do. It's because you have to have so many things working at once, right? Your animal has to be happy and healthy and ready to go and ready to perform. We were monitoring eye movements as behavioral readout, which required, back then you couldn't do it with a video camera like you can now. So we had, what's called an eye coil, which is a loop of biomedical wire on the eye, and then the animal would sit in this alternating magnetic fields, which would induce a minor current in the coil, and that's how we read out eye position. And we had these LED boards that could turn on and turn off lights really rapidly. And then you've got to do the electrophysiology. So there's always the potential for noise, or you're in the wrong part of the brain, or it was. Yeah, I mean, it was, but incredibly satisfying. And I guess there was a part of me that I didn't realize that loved the problem solving part of that, because you kind of got to be like MacGyver, if you remember that show. So yeah. It's like things are going wrong and you're up in the ceiling, trying to get, to ground things. I mean, it was, I remember I missed many dinners with my wife and her family. Her family lived in New York, and then they would say, "Oh, we're going to go out to dinner tonight." And it's 9 p.m. and I'm still trying to run the experiment.
Yeah,
that's
the life of a scientist.
It is. I mean, it's really it was really galvanizing. It was a great time in my life, and I'm glad I had the energy and the opportunity to really do that.
And so in humans, the part of the brain that's much bigger than in the monkeys you were working with is the front of the brain,
right?
Prefrontal cortex, and a lot of your work since you left NYU has focused on actually two parts there. The cortex, prefrontal cortex, but also there's a region under that, right under that, called the anterior cingulate cortex. And so you continued working in monkeys, now recording from neurons in those brain areas when you're having the animals do foraging tasks. So some of your papers, you use like I don't know how you do it, but a virtual reality type thing to evaluate foraging.
Well, that's a stretch to call it virtual reality, but
right.
it's it's an implementation of, so foraging is when you're out, you could be out in an orchard picking apples, for example, and you're picking apples from one tree, and at some point you decide to move on to another tree because they're harder to find or they're not as ripe. And so we engage in these kinds of foraging decisions all the time. All animals do. I had foraging was kind of my first love in some ways back when I was a graduate student. There are theories that intelligence in primates, that one of the drivers was because primates generally feed on a diverse array of hard to find foods. We see a lot of primates that actually use tools in extractive foraging. So that, in fact, that was kind of part of my PhD thesis. And foraging itself in the 1960s and 1970s became an area of ecology where economics and optimization theory had a big impact. And so there were a bunch of guys coming up with models, first principle models about how an animal ought to forage, basically, and make predictions about what they do. And this was a time where everybody was thinking about decision making and neuroeconomics, and I thought, well, let's really go back to basics, right? Brains seem to be designed to make these computations. In fact, all animals studied, hundreds of species, including humans, seem to obey the predictions of these optimal foraging models. Not just when you're foraging for food or water, but even in humans, when you're foraging for information on the internet, or when you're shopping, or when you are actually searching memory for information. So the same computations seem to be invoked. And that makes a lot of sense evolutionarily, right? So evolution doesn't just make up a new device every time you come up with a new challenge. It says, well, we've got this other mechanism that works. Let's just feed that challenge, that problem into that computation, which was the hypothesis that was guiding us. And so that's why foraging became a hot topic for us. And it's gratifying because it's actually taken off in the field. So it's become kind of part of the standard toolkit for studying decision-making in mice and in monkeys and in humans. And that's pretty cool.
And can you talk about you have this, patch foraging paradigms where the animal has to make a decision on whether to leave a patch of food and go to another place. That is, have they pretty much depleted the food in that area, and should they spend any more energy there or go somewhere else? So what happens when you're recording, say, from neurons in the cingulate cortex?
Yeah, so we've actually studied two parts of the cingulate cortex, the anterior cingulate and the posterior cingulate, which are heavily interconnected. The posterior cingulate is a core part of the default mode network, which has become a really hot topic. It's shut down when you are really engaged in doing something here and now, and it comes online and is active when you disengage and you explore, and also is associated with creativity and things like that, but kind of divergent thinking. And the anterior cingulate cortex, we know, is involved in task switching and computing errors and things like that. And so we studied both of these areas, and what was really interesting first of all, in the behaviorally, monkeys in the lab do exactly what we would predict they would do in the real world, which is they follow the predictions of the marginal value theorem, which is the key optimal foraging model that says you should leave a depleting resource when the instantaneous intake rate falls below the average for the environment, because if you stay any longer, you're doing worse than you could by going somewhere else, including the travel costs in time and energy. So makes complete sense. And it's super simple. And the math is simple. And monkeys do that. And when we were, so there's another component of that, which is that if you change the richness of the environment, then you change that calculation. So if you're in a rich environment and it's easy to get to the next patch, you should leave where you are sooner because you'll do better. Or if it's a really poor environment, the next patch is 10 miles away, you should stay where you are until you've gotten every single last apple from that tree, right? And you see that in monkeys in the lab and in the wild. So what we found is really interesting in anterior and posterior cingulate. In anterior cingulate cortex, basically every time the monkey makes a decision to stay where he is, the neurons would fire. But the longer the animal persists in the patch, the harder and harder and harder these neurons would fire until they would reach this peak level. And that would happen right before they would make the decision to forage and move on to the next patch. And what was really kind of fascinating is that when the monkeys were in a richer environment, that peak would be reached sooner than if the monkeys were in a poorer environment. So it seemed like that we connected this to a very common standard implementation of kind of drift diffusion model, which is this integration to a threshold, which seems to be a ubiquitous computational routine in the brain, which we found to be incredibly satisfying. In the posterior cingulate cortex, we observe something different, but what's interesting is the time scale over which activity kind of ramps up in the posterior cingulate cortex is very, very long, like tens and tens of seconds, if not longer, which doesn't seem that long, but by the standards of the typical decision-making task, which takes 3 seconds, this is a long time. And the posterior cingulate neurons kind of would hang on to this information. So in the anterior cingulate cortex, the neurons would burst and then they would be done. So we were wondering, well, where is the information about that was carried there momentarily actually stored? And it seems like maybe it's in the posterior cingulate, which we think of as being perhaps more involved in the long-term behavioral state or guidance of longer-term strategy. So am I in a state where I'm sticking with what I've got, or I'm going to move on? And we tested that in the posterior cingulate cortex with a different task. Same neurons used a different task, which was a traveling salesman task. So you think of it as a different kind of foraging task. So imagine you have a ring of places you have to visit as a salesman. And only some of those homes are going to actually buy your vacuum cleaner, right? And you don't know which ones. This is what the monkeys are doing. So some of these places would have reward and others would not. And the monkeys developed rapidly, and this was also really wonderful, rapidly developed what Darwin originally called a trap line. And he described in, I can't remember which book it was, he described the behavior of bumblebees as trap lining, where they would visit flowers and you go to nearest neighbors, basically. And it's called a trap line because trappers who would set a bunch of traps for fur-bearing animals would go and check all of their traps each day and retrieve the animals that were there. The most efficient way is to go between nearest neighbors, not kind of randomly around them. So in the lab, monkeys do that too. They establish these trap lines and they repeat them, but they occasionally break off from that and then diverge from these routines. And we saw that in the posterior cingulate cortex, we could predict when they were going to diverge from their routine behavior when the activity in the PCC got really high. And that was neat to us because it suggested in 2 different kinds of settings, the activity in this area would forecast that the monkey would kind of disengage and go look for something new, right? And that is really cool because, as I mentioned earlier, we know that the posterior cingulate cortex and the default mode network in general is really active when people explore. It's really active when you're thinking out of the box, right? So suggesting a real, again, I think, adaptive connection between a mechanism that evolved to solve this very common foraging problem, which now is in us implemented when you're, coming up with a new business idea.
All right, so during evolution, then one thing that seemed to happen in primate evolution is that individuals that cooperated with other individuals were more successful. For example, in acquiring food and working together towards common goals. And so I previously, from the perspective of brain evolution, I've had Kay Holcamp talking about her spotted hyenas and their social interactions and decision-making. Well, not really decision-making. And then I had Robin Dunbar talking about evolution of the social brain. Now, we make decisions all the time, and a lot of them have to do with decisions about interactions with other people.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the social brain with regards to decision making?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been fascinated by social interactions. I mean, this for a long, long time. I mean, it is a sine qua non of primate, primate behavior is that most primates are intensely social, and the complexity of primate social groups is exceptional in the animal kingdom. So, and for a variety of reasons. I mean, as you mentioned, primates cooperate, they form alliances and friendships, but they also compete with each other. So it's this delicate balance of competition and cooperation, ripe for game theory, of course, because that's what game theory is designed to do. But it is that complexity, I think, that and this is what Dunbar has argued as well as other people, that has perhaps driven the evolution of the primate brain. Now, we would say that it's more specific. It's not necessarily the whole brain, but it's specific circuits within the brain. And primates are unusual in the sense that they form these multi-dimensional, multi-layered societies with differentiated social relationships. So it's not just like, oh, I'm nice to my kin or something like that. So I know who my relatives are. I know who everybody else's relatives are. I know my rank relative to everybody, but I know everybody else's rank relative to everybody. And I use my behavior, I deploy my, goods and services, so to speak, to successfully navigate this in a way that, that I can, I capitalize. I try to make friends with high-ranking monkeys, for example, or maybe two lower ranking, so there's just this this calculus that seems to be really advanced and is really important. So we know that primates who are better at this kind of stuff live longer lives, they have higher reproductive success, and you see that in people too. So people who are able, either, because they have the combination of motivation and temperament as well as the skills to do it, they're going to be better off. They live longer, healthier, happier lives and make more money. So it's a real core feature of like the way our brains work. And in fact, we cannot escape the way our brains are tuned to social information. That's why, you see a man in the moon or, Jesus in the oil stain on your driveway. It's like, you can't help it, right? Pareidolia is a thing because that's the way we're wired. So it's but also the hardest thing to study, right? Because it's complicated, and to implement social interactions in the lab is kind of hard. You need to be able to preserve enough of the richness of a natural interaction, but still have some degree of experimental control, at least up until now. Now we've kind of taken the blinders off, and we're letting monkeys just have natural social interactions while we record from their brains, which is is pretty. It's a new thing, right?
Yeah,
Not done before, but Yeah, I mean, the social brain network, look, this is a major discovery of the last 15 years or so in neuroscience, which is that we have this more or less, I think, at least specialized, if not dedicated, set of brain areas that are wired together that manage our ongoing interactions with other individuals.
And what are those brain regions?
Well, people differ in exactly what they include in that, but it includes parts of the temporal cortex along and within the superior temporal sulcus. So these are areas that classically in monkeys and also in humans have been shown to play a role in perception, like seeing faces and where eyes are pointed and biological motion, things like that. There are, like the amygdala is an important part because it seems to be involved in adding emotional tone, valence to those interactions. The anterior insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, but a deeper part, along the gyrus, seems to be specialized part of this network. And then some people include the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. That's controversial, but and in humans, the temporoparietal junction, which was long thought to have no counterpart in non-human primates. So it's sort of this part of where the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe come together, and it's kind of mushroomed up in humans. And there's, and it was long thought to be uniquely human. And we now think, based on initially connectivity data, but now electrophysiological recordings that we've made, that this part of the superior temporal sulcus, the mid-superior temporal sulcus in monkeys, we think is the homologue of the human temporoparietal junction, which is really, I think, super exciting. And in humans, the TPJ is involved in theory of mind and getting inside the head of a partner or an opponent, predicting what they're going to do. And we found that neurons in the monkey middle superior temporal sulcus kind of do something very similar to that. So they carry information not just about the perceptual environment and not just about one's own actions, but what another individual might be doing, and like what the value of their different options is, and whether they're a cooperator or not, and your history of past interactions. So basically, to the kinds of secret sauce that you need to explain computationally the behavior of monkeys in a strategic interaction, we found the elements of all that secret sauce in the mid-superior temporal sulcus, which was long thought to be just kind of like a face processing area. So there's a lot more going on, back there in the kind of the back of the brain, if you will, than we thought before.
I've often thought, I'm not an expert on evolution or brain evolution even, but I've often thought that the case can be made that the major driver of brain evolution is food scarcity, and it's one of the theories, in addition to this social interactions and cooperation. But if you think about it, all the earliest tools we know about that were invented by humans had to do with acquiring and processing food. And it was the domestication of animals for meat and plants, grains in particular, that enabled the expansion of essentially cities. Before then, it was kind of a hunter-gatherer situation with maybe 50 to 100 in a group. So creativity, being able to invent things, imagination, working together, diversifying skills, and so specialization, which is what pretty much we all do now. We're all specialists. We're not hunter-gatherers and kind of generalists. And then so that, as far as the species goes, is a big advantage, being able to have different people with different skills that work together towards common goals. But what do you think about the notion that food scarcity, even for human brain evolution, was like overcoming food scarcity was a critical
Well, I
factor.
think that it's important to, recognize that like the demands of foraging often increase or put a selective pressure on the social structure. So you often see that the primates, for example, that forage on the most ephemeral and hard to find foods have the most complex social structures. So they're related to each other. It's actually, in fact, very difficult to disentangle in some ways social factors that might shape and provide and serve as a selective challenges, right, for the nervous system from the demands of foraging. So I think they go together, actually, which is why this sort of pendulum has swung back and forth, frankly, for the last 50 years in terms of what is the driver. I think it's both because they both go together. Yeah, tools enable new opportunities, but then the ability to make tools, right, and to come up with more elaborate processing to develop, as we saw over human evolution during the time of Homo erectus, the development of the Mousterian, hand axe, a biface, which was extraordinary. It's like the iPad of its day. It's like, or an iPhone. It's like everybody had one. They were beautiful, you could use them for a million different things. It's like, and it lasted for over a million years, but got continually refined. That information, it's like, if you had to discover that on your own, good luck. So that information was transmitted across generations by tutelage, learning, we imagine. So again, I think extractive foraging and social structure, social complexity, social capabilities kind of all go together.
And then language comes in importantly at some point.
It's key. I mean, it's key. Every time we try to think of, that's the one thing that really differentiates you, in my view, from other animals is language. There's no animal that has, other than humans, we're the only ones who have both semantics and syntax, so that we can take words that have meaning and combine them in new ways to make new meanings, right? There's nothing, even in all the language, so-called language trained chimps, none of them can really do that at all. And you don't see it in nature either.
Most of the important decisions we make nowadays take time. We get information through language, written or spoken, accumulate information, and then decide, do we have enough information? And then come up with our brain somehow using these mechanisms you've talked about, calculates a probability of, if I do this, there's these consequences. If I don't do it, there's these. Could you talk about that aspect? Was it something now you're getting into with trying to help businesses and groups of people in general make good decisions?
Yeah, I mean, part of that program, right, which is to try to take what we've learned about the human brain in general and what we've learned about differences in the way different people's brains might process information, right, in the way groups of people might process information is, in some ways, I would argue that we can do better if we learn the rules the brain lives by and don't, and then learn how to navigate those rules, right? So in terms of, there's a couple of really, I think, key ones that have really resulted from the study of decision-making and neuroeconomics over the last 20 years or more. One is that, as you mentioned, the brain accumulates evidence to make a decision. And this is an iterated process that takes time. This is actually, it's the optimal way to make a decision in a noisy environment, an uncertain environment. It was first defined by Alan Turing back when he was a code breaker for the Allies, World War II, when he was trying to break the Enigma code the Nazis used to encrypt their messages. So, we do the same thing, which is we take samples from the environment, whether it's external or internal, and we add them up. So we integrate over time to some threshold where we set a threshold that says, well, once I've reached this threshold, I have enough information to make a decision. What that means is it takes time. If you want to make a better decision, you need to set a higher threshold, right? But that takes a lot longer to do. If you need to go fast, you need to set a lower threshold, which means you're going to make more mistakes. And so in some sense, you have to decide before you decide. Do I need to be fast or do I need to be accurate? Because you can't be both, right? And so this is, I think, a really important message that people in business need to hear, because they feel like they've got to go, go, go. But if it's a really important decision, you've actually got to take time. And the other benefit of taking time is that when you slow down, this reduces arousal. And what you can think about arousal doing, emotional arousal, is acting as an amplifier on the data that your brain is accumulating. And some of that data is just noise. Some of that data is not, signal. And so if your amplifier is way up, you could cross the threshold. Your brain could cross the threshold for the wrong reason. You make a bad decision. So if you slow down, you can kind of turn down that amplifier and you're getting more signal and less noise potentially. So I think that's one thing that people benefit from learning. It's just like an inescapable fact of the way that our brains make decisions. The other one, go ahead. I was going to say the other one, which has been the subject of a lot of behavioral economics attention, which is the sort of tyranny of choice or choice fatigue, which is the observation that the more options you have in front of you, often the harder it is to choose. And when you do make a choice, you often regret it. This is not what economists proposed initially. It's like, if you have more options, you're more likely to find what you like, so your utility goes up. But in fact, it goes down, and it goes down because it's harder and harder to make a decision the more options you have. We now know that that's just a function of the way our brains work. Our brains are super demanding energetically, because every time a neuron fires a spike, it has to reset that battery. If it's doing that 100 times or 500 times a second, that's a huge demand on energy. So our brains have evolved to be very, very efficient, efficient coding. And one way our brains are efficient is they don't signal the absolute magnitudes of everything around us. So they signal contrast from the background. And you see that in visual illusions, right? That's why we see, funny visual illusions. But it turns out that happens in decision-making too. So if you go to the Cheesecake Factory and you look at that menu and there's like 100 things on it, the reason you can't it's hard to make a choice is because it's hard for the value of any one of those to stand out, because it's being divided by everything else. It's being normalized to the background. Whereas if there are two options, it's pretty easy to pick the one you like, right?
Well, and then an extension of that is then when you find one you like, even if you haven't sampled all 100, maybe you sample 3, you like one, and then you go back there and you keep getting that one, even though you haven't sampled the other 90.
Right. That's reinforcement learning. So, that's a super powerful driver of habits, right? That's and that's what gets hijacked by drugs of abuse. Why people find it hard to stop using drugs, whatever they might be, smoking, you name it. So that was like the first thing, the first thing that nervous systems really evolved to do once they started moving around was to repeat behaviors that led to things getting a little bit better.
Yeah.
And that's running in the background all the time. People think, oh, learning isn't happening. Once I've learned something, it's not happening anymore. It's running all the time, and we're sensitive to cues from the environment. Information in the environment is still hitting that reinforcement learning mechanism. So you can see that in the mass behavior of people. Like on a rainy day like today, people would be, and it hadn't been rainy in the past, people would be less likely to go out and buy things. not just because it's raining, but because the world seems a little worse than it was.
Oh.
Whereas if it's surprisingly sunny, people are going to go out and buy lottery tickets, you know, because it's the world's getting better and you're completely unaware of it. But that's why you need foraging, because once brains learn to form habits, then you get stuck potentially in local minima, right? Where things are okay, but you could do better maybe if you tried something new. And that's why you get this other mechanism in the brain, which allows you to disengage and explore. And so these, in some ways, reinforcement learning and exploration, foraging are fighting all the time in your brain, and they have to be regulated.
So in the monkeys, you can actually put electrodes in the brain and record neurons, but in humans, that's not practical. However, with the electrode recording, you get pretty much real-time feedback, whereas the functional brain imaging, it's a little slower, and it's you can't know whether the signal's coming from a particular neuron. You just know that in this area, maybe there's 1,000 neurons or something, there's a change. But there have been studies done, including some of yours recently, that I saw doing MRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, but the person is making decisions other than the MRI.
Yeah, I mean, it's, fMRI is great because it's non-invasive and allows us to take snapshots of the human brain in action. But it measures blood flow. It doesn't measure neurons, actually spiking or anything like that. So it's kind of agnostic to what the neurons themselves are doing. I mean, there are many different kinds of neurons using different, dozens of different neurotransmitters. Projecting to different areas. So you're just getting a big grand average. I mean, luckily, most of the fMRI studies seem to align with, what we've seen with single unit recording with electrodes in the brains of monkeys, that the key players are all there in the brain, and there's at least some pretty good alignment. I think if you squint hard enough, it looks pretty good. The other thing you can do in monkeys, it's a lot harder to, or animals in general, harder to do in people, is to manipulate these brain areas systematically. So turn them off, turn them on, turn them up, turn them down, turn off specific neurotransmitters or turn on specific ones. And so that's another reason why to look at causal relationships. That's harder to do in people.
Most of the vast majority of neural activity in the brain is neurons that deploy glutamate as their neurotransmitter. Glutamatergic, they're the excitatory neurons in all of these circuits you've been talking about. In fact, functional MRI, in my view, it's kind of reporting kind of a general level of glutamatergic activity. Now, what about, let's move to the prefrontal cortex, which has really been intensively studied. I made up a quick list of what people think the prefrontal cortex does, and it seems like it's about everything. Abstract thought, reasoning, working memory. It's involved in language. In fact, it's close to these language areas, Brokaw's and Wernicke's area. Creativity, imagination, planning for the future, multitasking, impulse control, ability to concentrate and tune out noise, insight and judgment, error monitoring, appropriate social behavior, empathy. Now, all these things I listed, when I just look at them, I say, well, all of these can be related to the decision-making.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, another way to think about it is that kind of everything anterior to the central sulcus is about behavior, just at different time scales, right? So it's all about behavior. It's all about action. So as you move farther and farther anterior, it's just the time scale gets longer and longer. You go from a muscle twitch or moving your finger to, when you get all the way to the front, it's like personality, which is your behavior over a lifespan, right? So it's, I think that kind of more or less works.
Yeah.
I mean, decision making, I think people get, there's a lot of debate about that term too, because it brings along a lot of, it implies a lot of things, it brings along a lot of baggage, but you can think about it in behavioral terms too, right? It's, and classically in economics, the way we would actually measure your preferences or utilities would be by looking at your behavior, your revealed preferences. So I think it's fine to kind of put those two together.
In brain evolution, there's this, evolution in general, there's this notion that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. In other words, that as, in case what we're talking about now, as the brain develops in the womb, in the baby, fetal brain develops, the first neurons that are born and the first neural circuits that are formed are in some of the more primitive brain regions. And then in humans, the last region that's thought to become fully developed is prefrontal cortex, which happens during the first 20 years of life. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and the relation of that to the decision making?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, I mean, that is a kind of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which goes back, I think, to Ernst Haeckel, the embryologist. And I think is more accurately said something like ontogeny recapitulates the ontogenetic stages of phylogeny. So it's like not the adult form, obviously, but the embryonic form. But yeah, the brain development continues for a long time outside the womb. If babies stayed in the womb as long, to finish brain development, then good luck getting out without killing the mother. There's a trade-off between birth canal size, hip width, and bipedalism. So that's been a real, that's a tricky needle to thread, so to speak, for evolution to have kind of hit the sweet spot. But humans are born in a very altricial state, requiring round the clock care for at least a year. And and babies can't do much, and children can't do much for a long time. So but yeah, the observation that brain development continues, and yeah, I mean, it looks like latest estimates are not done until you're about 25, like in terms of full maturation and full myelination of the major white matter tracts. And so yeah, people have made a lot of this. I think there's very easy and tempting to make a direct link between, oh, well, in children in particular, like teenagers, their whole motor systems, sensory systems, and motivational systems are mature, but the prefrontal cortex is not. So kind of the brakes that would be there to help, override impulses, or sensory driven behavior. It's hard, which is, it's tempting to tie that to risky behavior, to doing dumb things, basically. I mean, I would respond to that. Yes, I think that's probably true. I mean, but myelination, what are we talking? It's not like those neurons don't work. It's just that they're a little slower, let's say. So maybe the signals are not quite getting there in time. So that would enter the computation and maybe not the right, not the right stage of the computation. I don't know, something like that. And the other is that if you think about adolescence, again, in an evolutionary sense, I mean, that's a time when, I mean, let's face it. I mean, adolescents become reproductively capable in puberty. And over the human evolutionary life course, people were probably mating and pairing off in mid-teenagehood and weren't living longer than 30 or 35. So there may be actually a premium on risk-taking behavior, especially on the part of males, to stand out, to establish reputation, to potentially acquire resources, to, in the same way you see in other animals, right? So there may be adaptive explanations for some of the things that we take to be maladaptive on the part of, teenagers.
From the studies that looked at the white matter, the myelination during development of children, are there differences in the time course between males and females? But what you just said might imply maybe the females will become myelinated soon.
I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, the sort of sex differences have been, that's a controversial topic, especially now that we're also thinking about gender differences. But biological sex differences, in general, the emphasis is on that there's more similarity than difference, but there certainly are differences. And that's a good question I'm going to have to look up in terms of whether there are differences there.
All right, so let's move on to the Wharton Business School. What are you doing there? It's very interesting. And how are you taking the knowledge you've built up over more than, 3 decades now, and applying it, help, the idea is to help people make decisions.
So yeah, this was sort of the real disruptive potential of moving here to Penn, was to go to a top flight business school like Wharton, who was endorsing my vision that neuroscience will be a major part of business for the coming decades. When you look at Wharton or any other business school, probably like half the faculty are psychologists, actually.
Oh.
So why don't we just go one step further, go beyond psychology and go straight to the source of people's decisions, their behavior, right? All business runs on brains because all business runs on humans. And so, to the degree to which we can have a more precise understanding of human behavior and decision-making, of human nature, of who each person is, and what their talents, strengths and motivators are, and how those articulate with others, I think we can actually make all aspects of business more efficient, more effective, and more humane, which is sort of the vision. So, but admittedly, a crazy idea when I came here and had to be built from scratch. So we formed Wharton Neuroscience. Gosh, it was like 5 years ago. With the idea was a comprehensive vision. So we're going to lead the world in research, basically taking the insights, the knowledge, and the technologies from neuroscience and applying them to not only marketing, which is kind of the lowest hanging fruit, but decision-making, finance, innovation and entrepreneurship, management in particular, like leadership, team dynamics, assessment, development, learning, performance in general. All of these areas are ripe for advancement, right? Because they're kind of like, frankly, kind of stuck, with traditional approaches that, are the ones you use from psychology, which is asking people questions, survey-based. And we know that self-report is at best limited, but also biased, flawed, and, sometimes downright duplicitous. So people don't always tell you what they're thinking or feeling. And so that was the vision. We knew we had to do research, and that's what we're doing right now, to fill in the gaps in applications. So one thing about being in a business school, people are super interested in the material, but so you got to make it accessible. And they say, this is super interesting. How can I use it now? How can I use this now to make my business better, right? Or to improve my performance? So that took a lot of thought, and was the most fun part of the challenge. But you know, the idea is to do the research to fill in the gaps. Like, this is how it works in the lab, but let's show you how it works in a consumer environment or in your company. You know, we can improve key performance indicators, whether that's productivity or creativity or well-being is a big deal in business. So research, education, because we want to train the next generation of business leaders, not to be neuroscientists, but to be savvy about like being able to talk about neuroscience, to be able to consume it, to be able to use it, and know when and where it can be used, and what's good research and what's not. And then engagement. So a big part of our effort then is to actually work with companies to give us those opportunities to collect meaningful data in the real world, and to show them that there's a return on investment that's positive. And you know, so that's kind of the vision, and it's been more successful than I ever hoped in the ways, in terms of like people's excitement and enthusiasm and engagement. So we've got multiple companies working with us. We've got hundreds of students in the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative Student Society, which is an organic thing that they run. We have a curriculum for undergraduates and MBAs. We have a curriculum for executives, so we do executive education. We have our own standalone 4-day neuroscience for business program. I teach in a bunch of other programs. So the appetite is there. The awareness is growing. Our students are going off and getting great jobs, you know, doing neuroscience at, you know, Deloitte and McKinsey and Boston Consulting and Pepsi and, you know, Coca-Cola and Facebook, you know, so it's pretty awesome.
One thing that seemed, you know, from my own life and experience, and it took me a long time, is to recognize some of your own strengths and weaknesses with regards to social interactions, to decision making. And are there studies or efforts to, like, in companies, that when a person comes in to do like some a battery of psychological tests, and then say, oh, you know, you have these personality traits, or, you know, you're less empathetic than the average person, or something like that. And, you know, some people will, that kind of thing, they balk at and say, you know, that's kind of intruding on my internal.
I think that, well, companies have been doing this forever, and the way they do
okay.
it traditionally is you get an IQ test, you get a personality test, you know, of varying degrees of sophistication, and that would be used to determine what job you might get. But we know that those are not very, you know, it's not very accurate necessarily, especially personality tests, but other kinds of tests that are self-report, people will game it, you know, they try to answer it the way that they think you want it to be answered. Our own awareness is not always so good in terms of, you know, strengths and weaknesses. And what we're seeing is basically in the private sector, a movement toward gamification. So they'll give you some complex simulation, business simulation that might take an hour. It's like playing a game. What we're doing, and we're working on this with a number of companies now, is to put this in what we think of as a more is supported by the neuroscience, right? So it's well-validated assessments, not necessarily including biometrics, but we know that if we include those, we do better. But at a minimum, kind of presenting people with simple, easy games, so to speak, that we know from work in the lab over the last 20 years actually drill down into specific circuits in the brain. And we know that people vary on the continuum in terms of how those circuits function. And so the idea is to kind of get a comprehensive package, right? A report card, if you will, that shows where you are, and then relative to what would be optimal for that kind of job. And we're getting extremely good results doing this. some of the work we're doing is with the military, and what we're finding is that I mean, honestly, games we develop for monkeys, so they're nonverbal, you know, and like engaging, easy to, you know, doesn't take any training. And people and monkeys are overlapping in their performance. They're indistinguishable, basically. We know exactly where in the brain the computations are performed, and we've seen that, you know, but human experts in certain areas, people who are really good at certain kinds of high performance jobs, are kind of off the charts here. And what's really cool is those traits seem to generalize from, you know, across different kinds of jobs. It requires similar kinds of mindsets, if you will, that are very challenging. So even from sports to like cybersecurity, which is pretty wild, I think.
What are examples of some of those traits that?
Yeah, so well, one of the things we look at is the balance of exploration and exploitation that we pick up on with our foraging tasks, actually. So people who are naturally more creative, but also more likely to have attention problems are, you know, they abandon patches sooner. And people who are like more habitual, also more focused, better at routine tasks, stay longer in patches, for example. And that's one kind of benchmark that we use. Another is captured by a little soccer game we developed for monkeys a long time ago. And humans and monkeys play. It's great because you're basically one monkey's trying to shoot a ball past a goalie, and they rapidly develop very sophisticated interactions that clearly involve long-range planning and deception on the part of the kickers, and the goalies, in order to do really well, have to be able to get inside the head of their opponent and forecast what they're going to do based on what they've done in the past and what they're currently doing. Computational models of this, and we know exactly what parts of the brain are involved. And so that's like planning, focus, and counterintelligence. And so together, all those things actually are really good at predicting who's going to be a really good professional soccer player, for one, but also because it's above the neck, and who's going to be really good at like cybersecurity. So because they involve similar kinds of you know, tactical intelligence.
Very interesting. Let's see. Yeah, so what advice would you give our viewers and listeners so that they can improve their decision making, this kind of a practical everyday life?
Well, we talked a bit about slowing down. I think that's one.
Yeah.
If you do need to go faster, but you need to be accurate, that's where expertise comes in. So and expertise is really the process of learning what to pay attention to. So in knowing what data you can throw out, because you can only process so much information at once. I think, you know, recognizing capacity limitations on choice. Like most of us really can't handle too many options on the menu. And that applies, I think, also to more complex kinds of decisions. So if you're trying to buy a house, for example, and if you're trying to optimize over price, square footage, neighborhood, schools, commute, you know, parks, that's like too many dimensions to really process. So if you can narrow it down to the, you know, the 2 or 3 most important ones, I think, you know, in all these areas, it's like prioritizing and focusing your attention.
Recognizing your own bias in, you know, we talked about reinforcement, and this is contributing, I think, to the political division in this country that the self-reinforcement, people going back to the same source.
Yeah, I mean, being in a bubble is not good. It's for the breadth of information that you take in. What some of the work that I really find compelling here, and this is like collective decision making. So there's this phenomenon of synchronization occurs when you have a chemistry with somebody, when you really click. And we talk about getting in sync with somebody. That actually seems to really happen. So your brain activity will synchronize, and that's like a shared mindset. And if you're emotionally in sync, then your facial expressions, your arousal, your heart rates, your heartbeats will synchronize. Actually, your breathing will synchronize.
And the classic thing is the menstrual cycles in
that at a much longer time scale.
Young women, yeah, longer time scale, but that's controlled by the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but this happens at multiple time scales, multiple physiological processes. You can run it in reverse, which is that if you move together or breathe together, this synchronizes your brain, which is, I think, why all cultures have, singing, dancing, ritual activities that involve coordinated movement, because this gets you synchronized. Now, this happens in boardrooms, this happens in teams. So a big part of what you need to do is to get in sync rapidly when you know what you have to do. One thing that a study I really love from my friend Talia Wheatley's lab at Dartmouth showed that one of the purposes of conversation is kind of to get into mental alignment, to synchronize. So she had people who didn't know each other watch snippets of a movie and record their brain activity, and the people's brain activity, some of them were aligned, some were not. But then they would talk about the movie afterward, and then they'd go watch a new movie, and you would see that their brain activity was much more synchronized, because they had kind of been able to, through this shared experience and talking, come to a closer approximation of how to see the world. And I think that's what we need politically, right? And the problem is nobody's talking to each other.
Yeah.
And you sit in your own bubble, then you can't, then you could look at the same event. You see the same thing happening. Let's say it's in Ukraine. If you watch Fox News, you're going to see that one way. And if you watch, MSNBC, you're going to see it another way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting in that, we had COVID and a lot of, people worried about their health in general. And, you and I will go on PubMed, right? And that's where we'll go.
Yeah.
We'll go right to the main source. And unfortunately, though, when you Google any of these things, you may end up some rabbit hole where there are not actual scientists, and things have been taken. Yeah. So in this country, it's still a big problem. The science education overall is not as good as it should be. The general population is kind of, even just fundamental things with science on, what's the difference between possibility and probability, and and yes, this one person who got the COVID vaccine died 2 weeks after they got the vaccine. Well, that's out of 1 million people, and there's it didn't have anything to do with the vaccine, probably. Science education in the general public is becoming a big issue, because there's a lot of disinformation out there, and taking anecdotes and treating them like actual data or facts, or there's been statistics done on it.
But it's, and it cuts both ways. People, they're like, I think you said probabilities, everybody's estimates of probabilities are way off. So, and I think that is to some degree determined by your arousal, by, like how that, not how much that volume knob is turned up. So, it's really super fascinating study. I think it came out of Brookings Institute last year, showing that even in Democrats, for example, like their estimates of what's the probability that a person gets COVID, they end up in the hospital, and they were thinking it was like over 20%, it was like almost up to 50%. I mean, all these like wildly off by orders of magnitude. And obviously in Republicans is exactly the opposite. So that I think that this is kind of society-wide. Right?
Yeah.
It's not clear what's objective, and even things just about probabilities, people are way off on. And it just depends on who, what your sources of information are, what gets emphasized and what gets de-emphasized. And the best, actually, the person who summarized it best last year was Dave, the humorist Dave Barry, who it's not like I read all the time, but I, sometimes read his end of year piece. And he said basically, and the unvaccinated behaved like they were vaccinated, and the vaccinated behaved like they were unvaccinated.
Yeah, that's true, isn't it? Well, I'm not too concerned anymore about COVID, at least in the near future. Okay, well, Michael, I've enjoyed talking to you, and hopefully people have learned a little bit about how their brains make decisions, and they can apply this to their own life.
Yeah, it's been great. It's been a pleasure. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, Michael. Bye.
Bye.